Keep still. She said it to a man who had never obeyed anyone in his life. Vincent Carbone wired $300,000 at midnight, not to start a war, but to end one man quietly, professionally before dawn. The target was already seated. The shooter was already inside. The reservation, the table, the security positions. Carbone knew everything. He had paid for everything. What he had not paid for was a waitress who heard a sound nobody else heard. One click, one decision, one woman who threw herself at the most dangerous man in New Jersey and changed both their lives in the space of a single heartbeat. Subscribe now and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. Rachel Bennett had been on her feet for 11 hours when Table 18 walked through the door. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't need to. She could read a table in the time it took most people to unfold a napkin, the posture, the way they handed their coat to the host, whether they looked at the staff or through them. Years of double shifts at Bellini House had given her a kind of radar that no school could teach and no textbook could explain. It was the radar of someone who had been invisible for so long that she learned to see everything else with absolute precision. The man at table 18 sat down without touching the chair. Most people grab the chair. They pull it, they adjust it, they do the small automatic things that normal people do when they sit. This man simply arrived in his seat as if the chair had rearranged itself around him. His jacket was dark, expensive without being loud. His hands rested flat on the white tablecloth like two controlled arguments. He looked at the menu once, set it down, and didn't look at it again. Rachel refilled his water glass without being asked. He noticed. His eyes moved, not his head, just his eyes, a fraction upward, tracking the motion of the pitcher before returning to whatever calculation he was running behind that perfectly composed face. "Thank you," he said. 2 words. But the way he said them told Rachel 3 things: he was not used to thanking people, he had decided to do it anyway, and the decision had cost him something small, but real. She nodded, said nothing, moved on. That was rule 1 of working Bellini House's private room. You did not engage unless engaged. You did not smile unless smiled at. You became part of the furniture, functional, present, invisible. Rachel was exceptional at being invisible. What she didn't know as she moved back toward the service station was that the man at table 18 was watching her leave with an expression that almost qualified as surprised. Behind the kitchen door, Marco, the floor manager, appeared at Rachel's elbow like smoke. "You know who that is," he said. It wasn't a question. "Table 18, Rachel said, lifting a bread basket. "Rachel, his food will be ready in 7 minutes. I'm staying on top of it. That's Dominic Valenti." She stopped, not because the name frightened her, because she needed a half-second to separate the name from the newspaper photographs, from the quiet conversations she'd heard in diners and bus stops and break rooms across Newark and Jersey City. Dominic Valenti, property developer, philanthropist, the kind of man whose name appeared in headlines without ever appearing in courtrooms. Other names attached to him stayed quieter, stayed in certain neighborhoods, in certain conversations, in certain tones of voice that people used when they wanted to say something without actually saying it. "Okay," Rachel said. Marco stared at her. "That's it. Okay." "What do you want me to say, Marco?" His water glass is still full. His bread is almost ready. He's a customer. She picked up the basket. "I'll take care of him." Marco looked like he wanted to grab her arm. He didn't. He knew better. "Just don't be weird about it." "I'm never weird," Rachel said, already moving. She served his bread. She took his order, the branzino, a specific preparation he described in 3 precise sentences that told the kitchen exactly what he wanted without a single wasted word. She communicated it exactly as she'd received it. When she returned with his appetizer, Dominic Valenti looked up at her with an expression she didn't entirely understand. "You're not nervous," he said. Rachel set the plate down. "Should I be?" "Most people are. Most people don't have 7 other tables." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, more like a door opening a crack and then deciding to stay mostly closed. "Fair enough." She started to turn. "You remembered the lemon on the side," he said. "I didn't specify that." Rachel glanced back. "Branzino always comes with lemon, but the way you described the preparation, I figured you'd want it separate so you could control the amount. Was I wrong?" Dominic looked at the small dish of lemon wedges with something that might on a different face have been amusement. "No," he said. "You weren't wrong." Rachel nodded and moved on. She didn't know he watched her cross the entire dining room. She didn't know he spent the next 4 minutes thinking about the fact that a waitress had anticipated a preference he hadn't voiced. She didn't know that Dominic Valenti, who trusted almost no one on this earth, had just been slightly unsettled by a woman carrying a breadbasket. The private dining room at Bellini House had 3 entrances. Rachel knew every one of them. She knew the service door that stuck slightly in damp weather. She knew the main entrance with the frosted glass panels. She knew the emergency exit that nobody ever used, except the busboy named Carlos, who sometimes stepped out there to take phone calls from his mother in Guadalajara. She also knew every person who was supposed to be working that room on a Friday night. Which is why when she came through the service door at 9:47 to refresh the bread and check on table 18's main course timing, she noticed the man standing near the hostess alcove. Black jacket, staff badge clipped to his lapel. He was looking at his phone, which wasn't unusual. He was standing very still, which also wasn't unusual. But something about the combination of those things sat wrong in Rachel's chest, like a stone that had slipped sideways. Restaurant workers moved. Even when they were standing, they were moving, redistributing weight, checking the room, making micro-adjustments that the body performs automatically after years of working floors and stations. This man was standing the way a person stands when they are concentrating on not moving. Deliberate stillness, practice stillness, the kind that takes effort precisely because it looks effortless. Rachel didn't stop walking. She refilled the water at table 17. She checked in with the couple at table 19 who needed nothing. She moved to the service station, picked up a clean linen, and in the process of returning to the kitchen, passed close enough to the man in the black jacket to read his badge. The name on the badge was David. She knew every staff member on shift tonight. There was no David. She went through the kitchen door. Her heart was beating faster, but her face was not. This was something she had learned at 22, working a bar shift in a neighborhood where fights broke out with the casual frequency of rain. Your face was your protection. The moment your face showed what your chest was doing, you became part of whatever was happening. Until you absolutely had to, you stayed outside of it. Marco was by the pass. That man near the alcove. Rachel said, her voice low and completely even. Black jacket, badge that says David. He's not on shift. Marco frowned. What? He doesn't move like staff. He's been standing there for at least 8 minutes, and he hasn't been given a task or checked in with anyone. Do you know him? Marco looked through the small kitchen window toward the dining room. His frown deepened. I've never seen him before. He might be from the event team for the... Check, Rachel said. Right now. Something in her voice, not loud, not dramatic, just absolutely certain made. Marco pulled out his radio. Rachel picked up table 18's main course. She was going back out there. The branzino was perfect. She set it in front of Dominic, who had been nursing a glass of Barolo with the disciplined patience of a man who understood that some things were worth waiting for. He looked at the plate and then at her. The kitchen followed the instructions exactly, she said. You verified that before it left the pass. He didn't say thank you this time. He did something different. He actually looked at her. Not the polite surface-level acknowledgement that wealthy customers sometimes offered their servers. He looked at her the way he had been looking at the dining room all evening, systematically, carefully cataloging. Rachel met it without flinching. Is there anything else you need right now? She asked. No, Dominic said. And then quieter. You're very good at this. Rachel almost said it's just my job, which would have been the safe answer, the invisible answer. Instead, she said, I pay attention. Yes, Dominic said. I noticed. She was 3 steps away when she heard it. Click. Tiny, metallic, almost swallowed by the ambient noise of the dining room, the low music, the murmur of other conversations, the distant clatter from the kitchen. But Rachel's ears had spent 11 years tuning out exactly the right level of background noise in order to catch the sounds that mattered. The sound of a glass being lifted before it needed refilling. The sound of a voice dropping to the pitch that meant discomfort. The subtle percussion of a fork placed wrong that meant something was missing from the plate. She caught the click, the way a musician catches a missed note. Her body stopped before her mind fully processed why. She turned her head toward the alcove. The man in the black jacket was no longer looking at his phone. He was looking at table 18. And the angle of his right shoulder, the way his arm had shifted, the specific geometry of his elbow and forearm, was not the angle of a man holding a phone. Rachel's mind collapsed every piece of the last 40 minutes into a single point of clarity. fake badge, wrong movement, 8 minutes of waiting. That click. She spun. Dominic. His name came out of her before she'd consciously decided to use it, before she'd thought about protocol or propriety, or the 1,000 invisible rules of a Bellini house, Friday night. She covered the 3 steps between them in what felt like a single movement, her body hitting his before he'd fully processed the word, driving him down and sideways with a force she didn't know she was capable of, and a desperation she had no name for. The glass behind his chair exploded. The sound was enormous, a violent crack and shatter that ripped through the ambient noise of the restaurant like a stone through silk, then screaming, then the crash of a table going over, then the thunder of feet, heavy, purposeful feet, the kind that belonged to men who moved fast toward danger instead of away from it, converging on the private room from every direction. Rachel was on the floor, her left arm burned, not the burning of impact, the burning of something else, something sharper and more specific, starting at her upper arm and radiating outward like a struck match. She looked at her sleeve. The white fabric was darkening, spreading. "Don't move," said a voice above her. It wasn't gentle, but it wasn't cold. It was the voice of a man who was processing several things at once and controlling every single one of them. Rachel looked up. Dominic Valenti was crouched beside her, one hand on her shoulder, one hand flat on the floor, his body positioned between her and the direction the shot had come from. His face was composed in a way that should have been impossible under these circumstances, but she was beginning to understand that impossible composure was simply the expression Dominic Valenti wore the way other men wore their watch. "I'm fine," Rachel said. "You've been grazed." "I know. I said I'm fine." He looked at her for a long second. Then very quietly, "I heard you." Behind him, she could hear his security team moving through the restaurant, barking instructions, clearing the room. She could hear the hostess on the phone she assumed with the police. She could hear Marco somewhere in the kitchen doorway saying something in a high, panicked voice that was entirely unlike Marco's usual register. The man in the black jacket was gone. She knew it without looking. She knew it the way she knew when a customer was going to leave before they signaled for their check. Something in the energy of a room shifted when a person decided to disappear. "Your security team," Rachel said, forcing herself to sit up despite the burning in her arm. "They didn't see him. I'm telling you right now, they were watching the wrong positions." Dominic's expression changed, not dramatically, but the shift was real. He was recalibrating something. "How long were you watching him?" "Since 9:47, black jacket, fake badge. His name was David, and there's no David on this shift. He was standing wrong, too still." Then I heard the click and the angle of his arm. She stopped, took a breath. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds," Dominic said carefully, "like you saved my life." The room was still chaos around them. Red and blue light was already strobing through the windows from the parking lot outside. A paramedic appeared at the room's entrance with a kit following one of Dominic's men. Dominic didn't look at any of them. He kept looking at Rachel, and for the first time in possibly years, the most controlled man in the room had absolutely no idea what to do with what he was feeling. The graze wound needed 7 stitches. Rachel sat in the emergency room of Jersey City Medical Center at 11:15 on a Friday night and let a tired resident stitch her arm while the world reorganized itself around an event she was still processing. The local news had already picked it up. She could see the television across the room, the aerial footage of Bellini House with its blown-out private dining room window, the chyron at the bottom that said, "Shooting at Jersey City restaurant Mafia boss Dominic Valenti targeted." There was a younger word at the bottom of the screen, cycling through on rotation. "Hero." "You're the waitress," said the resident, tying off a stitch. He was 27, maybe 28, with the specific exhausted sincerity of someone doing his residency on the night shift. "I work at the restaurant, yes," Rachel said. "The news is saying you jumped in front of a bullet." "I pushed him out of the way of one. There's a difference." The resident looked up at her. "Is there, medically speaking, I mean?" Rachel almost smiled. Psychologically speaking, she didn't feel like a hero. Heroes in Rachel's experience were people who had the luxury of making choices. What she had done in that dining room had not felt like a choice. It had felt like an equation. Here is the information. Here is the conclusion. Here is the action. The same equation she ran 30 times a night about a dozen different tables. The delivery was different. The stakes were different. But the mechanism, the noticing, the connecting, the moving was the same mechanism she'd been running since she was 17 years old and working her first restaurant job to help her mother pay the gas bill. She called her mother from the waiting room. "I'm fine," she said before her mother could say anything. "I need you to hear me say that first. I'm fine." There was a silence on the other end of the phone that contained 14 different emotions in the order they arrived. "Rachel Marie Bennett," her mother said finally. "Mom, you're on the news." "I know. They're calling you I know what they're calling me." Another silence. Then quietly, "Are you really okay?" Rachel looked at the bandage on her arm. 7 stitches, she said. "I've had worse from a broken glass at work." Her mother made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry and was entirely itself. "Come home." "I will. Soon. There are people I need to talk to first." She didn't tell her mother that one of those people was currently standing in the hallway outside the emergency room, having apparently arrived without an appointment, and persuaded through some mechanism, Rachel didn't care to examine the hospital staff to let him wait. Tony Russo was 6'2" and built like a man who had spent 40 years preparing for conversations he hoped would never happen. He had the kind of face that revealed nothing, except that it was capable of revealing nothing, patient, watchful, perpetually assessing. He handed Rachel a coffee when she came through the emergency room door. She stopped, looked at the coffee, looked at him. "Mr. Valenti wanted to come himself," Tony said. "I told him it would cause a scene and he'd already caused enough for one evening." "You are," Rachel said. "Tony Russo. I handle security for Dominic." "Clearly not tonight." Tony absorbed that without expression. "Clearly not tonight," he agreed, which was not the response Rachel had expected. "That's actually why I'm here." Rachel took the coffee. "Is that an apology?" "It's a conversation." Tony gestured toward a row of chairs along the wall. "If you have a few minutes." "My arm has 7 stitches in it, and someone tried to shoot my customer tonight. I have a few minutes." They sat. Tony looked at his hands for a moment, then at Rachel. "I need you to tell me everything you noticed about the shooter before the shot. Everything. In order." Rachel told him. She told him methodically the way she reconstructed a complicated order for a complicated kitchen, the arrival time she'd first noticed him, the specific nature of the stillness that had been wrong, the badge, the angle of his arm, the click. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't minimize it. She simply reported what she had observed in the sequence she had observed it. Tony listened without interrupting. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did something that Rachel, who was very good at reading what people's eyes did when their faces weren't cooperating, identified as the particular quality of a man revising a conclusion he'd already reached. When she finished, Tony was quiet for a long moment. "My team," he said, "had the main entrance, the service exit, and the parking structure. We had eyes on the kitchen. We had a man inside the room itself." "The alcove was uncovered," Rachel said. "The alcove," Tony repeated slowly, "was supposed to be covered by a member of the venue's event staff." Rachel looked at him. Tony looked at Rachel. The same conclusion arrived in both of them at the same time from different directions. "Someone," Tony said quietly, "knew we'd be relying on the venue's own people to cover that position." "Which means someone knew your security configuration," Rachel said. "Yes." "Which means someone inside," Tony said. It cost him something to say it. She could see that. Someone who had access to tonight's plan. Rachel held her coffee with both hands and looked at the fluorescent hospital ceiling for a moment. Then she looked back at Tony. "Mr. Russo, I have 7 tables tomorrow morning starting at 9. My manager is going to want me in for a full debrief. My mother is going to want me home, and I'm going to need to give a statement to the police at some point before sunrise. So I'm going to ask you directly, why are you here talking to me instead of to whoever is actually responsible for figuring out what happened tonight?" Tony looked at her steadily. "Because," he said, "the person who figured out what happened tonight is sitting in front of me, and I need to know whether she can be trusted." The coffee was terrible. Hospital coffee always was. Rachel drank it anyway. "You're asking me if I can be trusted," she said. "I saved his life." "People do things for reasons," Tony said. "I need to understand yours." "My reason," Rachel said, "was that I heard a sound, I connected it to a situation, and I acted. That's the entire reason. I didn't know who he was when I first decided to act. I knew his table number." Tony studied her, the kind of study that had probably unnerved hundreds of people over the years. Rachel waited it out with the patience of someone who had spent a decade waiting out difficult customers, difficult managers, difficult mornings, and difficult nights. "All right," Tony said finally. "All right what?" "All right, I believe you." Rachel set down the coffee. "With respect, Mr. Russo, I don't need you to believe me. I'm going home, I'm going to sleep, and tomorrow morning I'm going to open Bellini House because that's what my manager needs. Whatever is happening in your world is your world's problem." She stood. Tony said, "Miss Bennett." She paused. "Someone photographed you leaving the restaurant," Tony said. 3 different angles, before the police arrived. The night air suddenly felt different, not colder, just different, shifted in some fundamental quality, the way a room changed when someone unexpected walked through the door. Rachel turned slowly. "The shooter looked at you," Tony said. "We have it on footage. Before he ran, he turned back specifically to get a look at your face." He paused. "That's not what a professional does when he's finished with a job. That's what a professional does when the job isn't finished." Rachel stood very still. Her arm burned under the bandage. The fluorescent light hummed above them in the empty hallway. "Tell me what that means," she said, even though, because she was Rachel Bennett, because she paid attention, because she connected information, the way other people connected dots, she already knew. Tony looked at her with something that on a different kind of man might have been called sympathy. "It means," he said quietly, "that you saved his life tonight, and as of approximately 2 hours ago, that has made your life very complicated." Detective Samuel Reed arrived at the hospital at 12:43. He was 51, built like someone who had been solid once and was maintaining it through sheer stubbornness, with the specific brand of tired that belonged to men who had spent 3 decades watching bad situations evolve into worse ones, and had developed patience as a survival mechanism rather than a personality trait. He looked at Rachel, then at Tony, who was still sitting in the hallway. "Mr. Russo," Reed said, "you can leave now." "I'm comfortable," Tony said. That wasn't a question, a long pause during which both men occupied the hallway with the specific gravitational heaviness of people who had been in each other's orbit for years without ever being in the same orbit willingly. Tony stood, looked at Rachel. "Think about what I said." Reed waited until Tony had rounded the corner before he sat down in the vacated chair and opened a notebook that looked like it had survived several different decades. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I'm Detective Samuel Reed, Organized Crime Division. I've been watching Dominic Valenti's world for a long time. Tonight you became part of it. I'd like to make sure you understand what that means." "I already had that conversation," Rachel said. "With Russo." Reed's voice carried a tone. "Right, okay. Here's what Russo won't tell you, because Russo's job is to protect Dominic Valenti's interests, not yours." He opened the notebook. "The shooting tonight was professional. Caliber positioning method of entry. This was not opportunistic. Someone planned this. Someone knew Valenti's reservation, knew his table, knew his security positioning." "Internal leak," Rachel said. Reed looked up. "Russo did tell you." "Russo confirmed it. I got there myself first." Reed looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. "Okay," he said. "So you understand that this wasn't random, and that whoever did this has resources, significant resources. Surveillance of you has already begun. We have that confirmed through our own monitoring." He paused. "Your mother lives on Glenwood Avenue." Rachel's chest contracted. "She's fine," Reed said immediately. "Right now she's fine. But whoever ordered this shooting does not like loose ends. And you, Miss Bennett, are currently the most visible loose end in what could become a very serious organized crime war." He set the notebook on his knee. "I want to be honest with you, because I don't think anyone else in your life right now is going to be completely honest with you. Your safest option is protective custody through the department. We can place you and your mother." "Can you guarantee her safety?" Rachel asked. Reed opened his mouth, closed it. "Be honest," Rachel said. "You just said you'd be honest." "Under current resource constraints," Reed said, and the way he said it told her everything she needed to know about what came after those words. "I cannot guarantee the same level of continuous physical security as a private arrangement." Rachel looked at the ceiling. The honest truth was sitting in the room like a third person. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that the man I saved tonight can protect me better than the police can." "Under current circumstances," Reed said. And then more quietly, with something that sounded almost like an apology underneath the professional tone, "Yes, right now, probably yes." Rachel closed her eyes. 7 stitches. Her mother's voice on the phone. A man in a black jacket who had looked at her face before he ran. "I hate this," she said. "I know," Reed said. "I want it on record that I hate this." "Noted." She opened her eyes. "Tell me what I need to know." By 3 a.m, Rachel Bennett was sitting in the back of an armored SUV on the way to a property she'd never heard of, on a road she'd never traveled with 3 men whose last names she didn't know. Her phone had a new number. Her mother was being relocated. Reed had arranged it. Dominic's team had facilitated it, a combination that had required both men to operate in the same space without technically cooperating, which seemed to involve a great deal of professional non-eye contact. Tony drove. Nobody spoke. Rachel looked out the window at the lights of northern New Jersey sliding past familiar territory made strange by 3 a.m, and 11 hours of shifts, and an arm that had been grazed by a bullet, and 7 stitches, and a detective telling her that a Mafia boss was her best chance at survival. She thought about calling Marco to tell him she probably wouldn't make the morning shift. She thought about her coffee maker at home, which made better coffee than the hospital, though the bar was low. She thought about a man sitting in a private dining room who had looked at a lemon dish with something that almost qualified as amusement. "Mr. Russo," she said. Tony looked at her in the rearview mirror. "What's he like?" she asked. "Actually, not the newspaper version." Tony was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Careful," he said. "He's very careful." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "He hasn't laughed in a long time," Tony said finally, and the specificity of the answer surprised her. "Not really laughed, the kind that isn't about anything except the thing being funny." Rachel absorbed that. The SUV turned onto a private road flanked by trees whose branches had grown together overhead. "I wanted to come to the hospital himself," Tony said quietly. "I told you that." "You said it would cause a scene." "It would have." Tony paused. "But that's not the whole reason he listened to me." Rachel waited. "He didn't come," Tony said, "because he didn't know how to walk into a hospital and say thank you to someone who had absolutely no reason to do what you did. He spent 30 years in a world where everything has a reason. Everything is an angle, a calculation, an exchange. Someone saves your life, there's a price attached. There's always a price." He glanced at the mirror again. "You threw yourself at a man you'd known for 40 minutes because you heard a click. No angle, no calculation. Just the right thing." A pause. He didn't know how to respond to that. Rachel said nothing for a while. The estate appeared a headlights behind iron gates, a long approach, the specific quality of security that made itself visible without advertising itself. "Tell him," Rachel said finally, "that he doesn't need to know how to respond to it. He just needs to say thank you. 2 words. He managed it at the table over a lemon dish. I think he can manage it again." Tony made a sound. It took her a moment to identify it. He was almost laughing. The gate opened. The SUV moved through, and Rachel Bennett, who had spent her entire adult life being invisible, drove into the most guarded address in northern New Jersey with her 7 stitches and her terrible hospital coffee, and the burned clarity of someone who understood, without being entirely happy about it, that her life had just become entirely irreversibly different. The question was not what had changed. The question was what she was going to do about it. And somewhere inside the main house in a study, where the lights were still on at 3 a.m, Dominic Valenti sat with a glass of Barolo he hadn't touched, and a question of his own that had nothing to do with who had tried to kill him. He was thinking about a woman who had heard a sound nobody else heard, who had moved when everyone else froze, who had looked him in the eye in a hospital corridor and said, "I'm fine," with a conviction that challenged him to argue with it. And he was thinking for the first time in a long time about what it meant that the most dangerous person in his dining room tonight had been carrying a breadbasket. The first morning Rachel woke up inside Dominic Valenti's estate, she didn't know where she was for exactly 4 seconds. Then she remembered. The ceiling was wrong. Too high, too quiet, too far from the sound of her neighbor's television bleeding through the apartment wall at 6 a.m. No smell of the bakery 2 blocks down. No distant sound of the number 42 bus making its first run of the day. Just a silence so complete it had its own texture, and 4 seconds of pure disorientation before her brain caught up with the last 12 hours of her life. She sat up. Her arm ached under the bandage. The room was clean and simply furnished, not the ornate excess she'd half expected, but something almost deliberately understated. A bed, a chair, a window with the blinds already drawn by someone who understood that security and comfort were not mutually exclusive. Rachel got up dressed in yesterday's clothes and went looking for the kitchen. She found it by following the smell of coffee. She also found Dominic Valenti standing at the counter in a gray shirt with his sleeves rolled up, reading something on a tablet, looking entirely like a man who had not been almost assassinated 6 hours earlier. He looked up when she came in. "Coffee," he said, which was not quite a greeting but was close enough. "Please," Rachel said. He poured it without being asked and set the cup on the counter where she could reach it. She noticed he remembered she hadn't touched cream or sugar at the restaurant. She filed that away without commenting on it. They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen for a moment, in a silence that was unexpectedly not uncomfortable. "You slept," Dominic said. It came out somewhere between observation and surprise. 4 hours, Rachel said. "It's enough. Most people after what happened last night would not have slept at all. Most people didn't work a double shift before it happened." She wrapped both hands around the mug. "My mother, is she arrived at a safe location at 2:15 this morning. Tony confirmed it at 4. He paused. "She's unhappy about the situation. She's unhappy about most situations. It's how she expresses love." Rachel drank the coffee. It was excellent, not a surprise, but a relief. "How are you?" Dominic looked at her. "That's not a complicated question," Rachel said. "No one asks me that." "I'm asking you now." He was quiet for a moment, in the specific way of someone who was not accustomed to honest answers to honest questions. Not because he was dishonest, but because in his world the question itself was usually a strategy. Someone asking how you were doing was gathering information, positioning, looking for weakness. The question was a tool, not a conversation. "I'm thinking," he said finally, "about who did it. About how they knew." He set down the tablet. The reservation was made under a secondary name. The table assignment wasn't confirmed until 4 hours before arrival. The security positioning was finalized at 6. The only people who knew all 3 pieces of information were inside my own organization. "That's what bothers you most," Rachel said. "Not the attempt, the leak." "The attempt," Dominic said evenly, "is a problem I understand. Someone wants me dead. I've navigated that before. The leak means someone I trusted chose someone else. That is a different kind of problem." Rachel looked at him over her coffee. He was speaking to her, she realized, as if she were a person who could handle the information. Not as a witness to be managed or a liability to be contained. He was actually talking to her. She wasn't sure he'd done that with anyone in a long time. "What happens now?" she asked. "Tony is running the investigation internally. Reed has his own parallel track. I have no control over that, and I'm not attempting to." He paused. "And you stay here until we understand the full picture of what you're exposed to." "I have a job," Rachel said. "You have a situation." "I have both," she said, and her voice was even enough that he didn't argue. "I'm not disappearing from my life because someone decided to make me a problem. But I also understand I can't go back to my apartment. I can't put my mother at risk, and I apparently can't operate as if last night didn't happen." She set down the mug. "So I'll stay, for now, on my terms." "Your terms," Dominic said. "I'm not a guest here who needs entertaining. I'm not someone you've taken on as a project. I saved your life last night because I paid attention and I moved fast. That's the entire nature of my relationship to you. If that changes, if this becomes something else, something I don't agree to, I need you to tell me, because I will walk out that door and take my chances with Detective Reed's limited resources." The kitchen was very quiet. Dominic looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the door cracking open, and then mostly staying closed, the micro-recalibration of a man who had developed his entire personality around controlling the terms of every situation he entered, and was now encountering someone who kept presenting entirely new terms. "All right," he said. "All right what?" "All right, your terms," he said. And then, "I don't know your name, your actual name. Russo referred to you as Miss Bennett in my presence, but last night you said—" "Rachel," she said. "Rachel Bennett." He nodded. "Dominic. I know who you are." "The newspaper version," he said, and for a fraction of a second something almost wry moved across his face. "Among others." She picked up her coffee again. "Tell me what I can actually do while I'm here. I don't sit still well." "I noticed," Dominic said. And that was how the first morning began. By 10 o'clock, Rachel had identified 3 things about the estate's security setup that she didn't like. She said so to Tony, who looked at her the way a very patient man looks at someone who has just told him his house is on fire while he's standing in it. The camera covering the east service entrance, Rachel said, has a field of view that ends 4 feet before the door. Anything approaching from that direction has a 2-step blind spot. Tony looked at her for a long moment. How did you... I walked the perimeter this morning. She paused. Is that a problem? You walked the perimeter. I needed air, and I needed to understand the space I'm in. That's how I work. Tony looked at Dominic, who was standing in the doorway of the room they used for morning briefings. Dominic made a small gesture that Rachel interpreted as, go on. The delivery access point on the north side, Rachel continued. You're relying on a vehicle registration check at the gate, but if someone has access to your internal communication, which given last night appears to be a real possibility, they can produce a credential that passes your check. She paused. You need a secondary confirmation that doesn't run through any of your existing communication channels, something offline rotating that only 2 people know. The room was very quiet. Tony looked at Dominic again. This time the look was different. This time the look said, where did she come from? Dominic said very calmly, what else? Rachel told him. She told him about the 3rd point, the timing pattern of the guard rotation that she'd observed from her window, which had a 40-second predictable gap every 45 minutes. And as she spoke, she watched the 2 most formidable men in the room respond with the specific quality of people confronting information they should have had already. She wasn't showing off. She wasn't trying to prove something. She was doing what she always did, paying attention, connecting pieces, stating conclusions. The mechanism was identical. The setting was different. How, Tony said when she'd finished, do you know any of this? I've worked restaurants in 4 different neighborhoods in 2 cities, Rachel said. I've managed a dining room with 8 staff and a kitchen that was trying to kill itself every Friday night. I've dealt with suppliers who double-booked, with event planners who changed requirements at the last minute, with 100 different ways that a coordinated operation can develop a gap at the exact wrong moment. She looked at him evenly. The principles are the same. The stakes are different. Tony sat back. Dominic said nothing. But something had shifted in the room, something real and permanent, a recalibration that both men performed independently and arrived at together. The woman they had brought here for her protection was currently improving their security. By noon, Tony had implemented 2 of her 3 recommendations and was on the phone with a contractor about the 3rd. By 1 o'clock, Rachel had found the kitchen determined that whoever normally cooked for the estate had the week off and was making herself a sandwich when Dominic appeared in the doorway. You cook, he said. I make sandwiches, she said. There's a difference. Do you want one? He looked at the sandwich, then at her. You're offering to make me a sandwich in my own kitchen. You offered me coffee in your kitchen, Rachel said. It seems equitable. She was already getting more bread. Sit down. Tell me what's actually happening with the investigation. He sat. He told her. He told her what Tony had found so far, which was not enough because the leak had been careful, had used communication channels that were difficult to trace, had structured the information handoff so that several different people had each passed one piece without any of them holding the complete picture. Professional, patient. Someone who understood how Dominic's operation worked well enough to use its own architecture against it. That takes time, Rachel said, handing him the sandwich. Someone didn't improvise this. They spent weeks building it. At least, Dominic agreed, which means whoever ordered it has been planning it for weeks, which means they're not going to stop because the first attempt failed. She sat across from him with her own plate. You already knew that. Yes. Who benefits most from your organization being destabilized right now? Dominic ate the sandwich. He chewed slowly, and she could see him deciding something not about her, but about how much to say to her, about where the line was. She didn't push. She waited. There's a man, Dominic said. Vincent Carbone, 56. He runs a separate organization on the southern side of what we both consider our territory. For 3 years, he and I have had an understanding, a boundary. He stays on his side, I stay on mine, and neither of us does anything that requires the other to respond. An understanding that benefits him, Rachel said. It benefited both of us. But recently, Rachel said, reading his face, it began to benefit him more. Dominic was quiet. You've been pulling back, she said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. From some of what you do, not entirely, but the direction has been moving away from expansion and toward consolidation. And to someone like Carbone, who operates entirely by the logic of territory and growth, a man who stops expanding looks like a man who's getting ready to fall. Dominic set down the sandwich and looked at her with an expression that was no longer the carefully controlled blankness she'd first encountered at table 18. It was something rawer than that. Something that had been sitting behind the composure for a long time and was encountering possibly for the first time a person who could see it without having been told it was there. "How," he said quietly, "do you do that?" "Do what?" "See things," he said. "People, situations. You walk into a room and it's like the room reorganizes itself around how you look at it." Rachel looked at him for a moment. "I've been invisible my whole life," she said. "When you're invisible, you spend a lot of time watching what visible people do. Eventually, you start to understand it better than they do." She picked up her coffee. "Your organization has a leak. Carbone is probably the source of the money on the other end. The person inside your organization who sold you out is either someone who needed money badly enough to take a risk, or someone who was made an offer they couldn't refuse." "Shh. The latter is more likely," Dominic said. "People in my organization don't usually have financial problems without me knowing about them." "Then someone was pressured," Rachel said. "Threatened, or someone they love was threatened." Dominic's expression shifted. "That would fit Carbone's pattern," he said slowly. "He doesn't use direct violence unless he has no alternative. He prefers leverage, debt, obligation." "Which means," Rachel said, "when you find whoever it is, they're probably as much a victim of Carbone as you are." The kitchen was quiet again. Dominic looked at her. "That's a generous interpretation," he said. "It's an accurate one." She met his eyes. "What you do with it is your choice. I'm not in a position to have opinions about your world." "You're having quite a few opinions about my world," Dominic said. "Observations," she corrected. "I make observations. You can do whatever you want with them." And this time, unmistakably, the corner of his mouth moved. Not much, but enough. The afternoon passed in a way that Rachel had not expected, not the tense, guarded isolation she'd braced for, but something more functional than that. Tony brought her a secure phone with her mother's new temporary number. Rachel called and spent 20 minutes navigating her mother's complex feelings about the situation, which cycled through worry, pride, more worry, indignation on Rachel's behalf, and finally a pragmatic inquiry about whether the people keeping her safe were at least feeding her properly. "The sandwich was good," Rachel said honestly. Her mother paused. "You made it yourself, didn't you?" "The kitchen was available." A sigh that contained 30 years of knowing Rachel. "You are the most stubborn person God ever made." "I learned from somewhere," Rachel said. When she hung up, she found Tony standing outside the door with the specific expression of a man who had been listening without intending to and was now slightly embarrassed about it. "She sounds like a lot," Tony said. "She's the best person I know," Rachel said without hesitation. "What did you find?" Tony's expression changed. The small, almost human moment closed like a door. "Come with me," he said. They went to the room Tony used as a situation space, a plain room with a table covered in printed files and 2 screens running surveillance feeds. Tony stood at the head of the table and didn't sit. Rachel had already learned that Tony never sat when he had something difficult to say, as if standing was a form of accountability. "I found the access point," Tony said. "The reservation system at Bellini House. Someone queried it using a back-end administrative credential. The credential belongs to an employee named Patterson Mid-Level Accounting, been with us 4 years, clean record, no flags." "Has Patterson been approached?" "We reached him this morning." Tony's voice was very controlled. "He didn't volunteer anything. We applied pressure." He looked at Rachel, gauging. "He broke in about 20 minutes. He didn't sell the information for money." Rachel waited. "His daughter," Tony said. "She's 11. She developed a serious cardiac condition 8 months ago. The treatment is expensive, more expensive than Patterson's insurance covers, more expensive than he could manage. He was drowning." Tony paused. "Someone from Carbone's organization approached him 6 months ago. They offered to cover his daughter's medical bills, all of them, past, present, and future, in exchange for access." The silence in the room was dense and complete. Rachel looked at the table. At the files, at the surveillance screens showing the quiet perimeter of the estate in the mid-afternoon light. He didn't think anyone was going to die, Tony said. He told himself it was just information, just an access point. He didn't know what it would be used for. But he found out, Rachel said. He found out when the news broke last night. He spent the morning trying to figure out how to disappear. Tony's jaw was tight. He's in a room down the hall right now. Rachel looked at the door. What happens to him? Tony looked at her. Tell me what happens to him, she said again. In our world, Tony said, what happens to someone who sold information that almost got the boss killed is not something I should describe to you in detail. He has a daughter, Rachel said. Patterson should have thought about his daughter before. Tony. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. He did think about his daughter. That's exactly why he did it. He was desperate, and someone handed him a lifeline, and he took it because there was nothing else to take. She stood up from the chair she'd been leaning against. I'm not saying what he did wasn't wrong. I'm saying that a desperate man and the man who made him desperate are not the same enemy. Tony looked at her for a long time. Then he left the room. He came back 20 minutes later. He sat down, which was unusual for him. He put his hands flat on the table the way Dominic had put his hands on the tablecloth at Bellini House, and he looked at the surface as if he were having an argument with it. Dominic wants to speak with Patterson, Tony said, and he wants you there. Rachel didn't ask why. She thought she understood why, and understanding it made her feel something she hadn't expected to feel in this house with these people in this particular situation. She felt like herself. The conversation with Patterson was not what she expected. Patterson was 43 and looked 60. He had the specific physical dimension of a man who had been carrying an enormous weight for a long time, slightly compressed, slightly gray, with eyes that had been red for many hours and were now simply depleted. He sat at the table in the plain room and looked at Dominic the way a man looks at the thing he's most afraid of in the world. Dominic walked in, sat across from him, said nothing for a full 15 seconds. Patterson started crying before Dominic said a word. I'm sorry, Patterson said in a voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, I know it doesn't... Stop, Dominic said. Patterson stopped. Dominic looked at him. The complete systematic look that Rachel had first experienced at Table 18, the look that cataloged and assessed and arrived at conclusions with the patience of someone who understood that correct information was more valuable than fast information. Your daughter's name, Dominic said. Patterson blinked. What? Her name? Sophie, Patterson said, confused by the question in a way that was almost worse than fear. Her name is Sophie. She's 11. Yes, Tony told me. Dominic was quiet for a moment. How is the treatment progressing? Patterson stared at him. The cardiac treatment, Dominic said. Has it been working? Yes. The doctors say she's responding. She's going to be okay, they think. They think she's going to be okay. Patterson's voice broke on the last word and then reconstructed itself. Please, he said. Please, whatever you're going to do, she doesn't know anything. She's just a kid. Please don't. Nothing is going to happen to Sophie, Dominic said. Patterson went very still. Nothing, Dominic repeated, is going to happen to your daughter. She will continue to receive treatment. Her care will continue to be covered through channels that Carbone no longer controls. He paused. And you are going to leave. Today. You're going to take Sophie and go somewhere Carbone doesn't know about, and you're going to stay there until this is finished. Tony has arranged documents. There's money for the transition. Patterson looked like the floor had disappeared under him. I don't understand. You were used, Dominic said, by a man who knew exactly where your breaking point was and put something in front of it. That makes you a tool Carbone used against me. He stood. It doesn't make you my enemy. The room was completely silent. Rachel, standing near the wall, watched Dominic cross to the door and then stop. He turned back. Don't, he said to Patterson in a voice that was soft and entirely clear. Mistake mercy for forgiveness. Or for protection if you ever consider going back. Are we understood? Patterson nodded. He was crying again silently, the kind of crying that doesn't have anywhere to put itself. Dominic left. Rachel followed him into the hallway. She had not planned to say anything. She was going to let the moment exist without commentary because some moments needed to breathe rather than be analyzed. But Dominic stopped in the hallway and stood with his back to her for a moment, and something about the posture of his shoulders, not defeated, not uncertain, but somehow newly exposed, made her speak. "That was the right thing," she said. Dominic turned halfway. "My men won't see it that way." "Your men," Rachel said, "see the world through a specific set of rules. You just operated outside those rules. That's going to make them uncomfortable." She paused. "It should." He turned fully then, looked at her. "You think I should operate outside my own rules?" "I think," Rachel said carefully, "that you just made the first decision I've seen you make that wasn't dictated by what the situation required from you. You chose what you wanted to do, for the reason you wanted to do it." She met his eyes. "I don't know how long it's been since you did that, but I could see that it had been a while." Dominic looked at her for a very long moment. "You're very difficult," he said finally. "I know," Rachel said. "Do you want more coffee?" He muttered a sound that was close to a laugh, but didn't quite arrive. "Yes," he said, "I do." They went back to the kitchen and outside the estate, in an office in Manhattan. Vincent Carbone received the news that Patterson had gone quiet, no contact, no response, and understood immediately what had happened. He stood at his window and looked out at the city, and felt something that his face was trained never to show. He felt something shift. Because Patterson going dark meant Patterson had been found. Patterson being found meant Dominic had not done to Patterson what Carbone had expected Dominic to do. And if Dominic had not done the expected thing, it meant something had changed in how Dominic operated. Carbone thought about the news footage he'd watched from last night. The restaurant, the blown-out window, the ambulance, and then the woman, the waitress. Her face on 3 different camera angles, her name in the crawl at the bottom of the screen. Rachel Bennett. He looked at his phone, made one call. It was brief and quiet. "Find out everything there is to know about the woman," he said. "The waitress, where she grew up, where her mother lives, what she wants, what she's afraid of." He paused. "And find out what she means to him. That's the most important part." He hung up. In the kitchen of the estate, Rachel was pouring coffee and telling Dominic something she remembered from a catering job she'd worked at 22 that had gone catastrophically wrong due to a supply chain failure and 3 vendors who hadn't communicated with each other, and Dominic was actually listening, not strategically, not calculatingly, but listening the way people listen when they've been starved for a particular kind of conversation for so long they don't realize how hungry they are until it arrives. Neither of them knew Carbone had made the call. Neither of them knew that the decision Dominic had made about Patterson, the first autonomous, rule-breaking, genuinely personal decision he'd made in years, had just been observed from a distance and correctly identified as a change. Neither of them knew that Vincent Carbone had just understood something that Dominic himself was only beginning to understand. Rachel Bennett wasn't merely someone Dominic was protecting. She was changing the way he thought. And to a man like Carbone, who had built his entire career on predicting what other men would do, there was nothing more dangerous in the world than an unpredictable variable walking around inside his competitor's house, rewriting equations that had held for 30 years. He had to move faster. He picked up the phone again. This time he called a different number. This time the plan he outlined had nothing to do with Dominic. It had everything to do with a woman named Rachel Bennett and a mother on Glenwood Avenue, and the specific leverage that came from understanding what a person was willing to risk their life to protect. He had found Dominic's new breaking point. He had no idea that the breaking point had eyes and could see him coming. The call came at 4:17 in the morning. Rachel was already awake. She'd been lying in the dark for the better part of an hour, running the same mental loop she'd been running for 3 days. The restaurant, the badge, the click, the angle of the man's arm, the sequence of events that had deposited her in a guarded estate in northern New Jersey with 7 stitches in her arm and a Mafia boss who made genuinely excellent coffee. Sleep had become a negotiation she was losing. So when the secure phone on her nightstand lit up with Tony's name, she picked it up on the first ring. "Something happened," she said. Not a question. Tony's voice was controlled in the specific way it got controlled when the thing he was controlling was serious. "There was an incident at your mother's location." Rachel was sitting up before he finished the sentence. "Is she hurt?" "She's fine. I need you to hear that first. She is fine. She was not harmed." A pause that cost him something. But there was an attempt. 2 men approached the building at 3:50 this morning. Our people intercepted them at the exterior. Your mother never knew they were there." Rachel sat in the dark with the phone pressed against her ear and breathed. One breath. Two. The same technique she used when a table sent back an order and a kitchen was already overwhelmed, and every instinct in her body wanted to react, while the situation required her to think. Breathe first, then move. "How did they find the location?" she said. "We don't know yet." "Who else knew where she was besides your team and Reed?" "That's what we're on, Tony. Who else knew?" A pause. Reed's office processed the arrangement. 2 of his people were involved in the logistics. "So either someone inside your organization or someone inside Reed's office," Rachel said. "And given that you've already found one leak, Carbone may have a second one we haven't identified yet." She was already moving, already reaching for her clothes in the dark. "I'm coming down." "Rachel, I'm coming down," she said again, and the steadiness of her voice was a decision, not a condition. She found Dominic in the Situation Room at 4:23. He was already there when she arrived, standing at the head of the table with Tony and 2 other men she'd seen around the estate but hadn't spoken to. There were maps on the table, actual printed maps, not digital, which told her something about how seriously they were taking the possibility of compromised communications. Dominic's face was the composed mask, but his eyes were different. She was learning to read the difference between Dominic's performed composure and his actual composure, and what she saw in his eyes right now was not the latter. He looked at her when she walked in, and for one fraction of a second the mask did something it hadn't done before. It cracked, just slightly, just at the edges, just enough for her to see that whatever he was feeling about the attempt on her mother was not something that fit neatly into the categories of strategic concern or professional responsibility. Then it was closed again. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand," Rachel said. "Tell me everything," he told her. 2 men, professional carrying identification that had passed a building security check, which meant the identification had been fabricated from information about the specific building's security requirements, which meant Carbone had done his research. The 2 men had been intercepted by Dominic's people, stationed outside a confrontation that had been brief and decisive, and had left both men in police custody by 4 in the morning. Reed had been notified. Reed was furious not at Dominic, which would have been politically convenient for everyone, but at himself in the specific way of a detective who understood that someone in his proximity had sold information that almost got a civilian killed. "My mother has to move again," Rachel said. "Already arranged," Tony said. "She needs to know it is me who's asking her to move. She won't cooperate unless she hears my voice." Rachel looked at Dominic. "I need 10 minutes with her phone before she's relocated." "You'll have it," Dominic said immediately. Rachel nodded. She looked at the maps on the table, then at the men around it. Then she said something that stopped the room. "I've been thinking about the original shooting," she said. "There's something that's been bothering me since the first night, and I couldn't figure out why until about an hour ago." Everyone looked at her. "Every attack Carbone has made," Rachel said, "has depended on information that became available only shortly before it was used. The reservation wasn't made far in advance. Your security positioning wasn't finalized until hours before. My mother's location was arranged the same night." She paused. "If Carbone has one source inside your organization, and possibly one inside Reed's office, he's operating in real time. He's not planning weeks ahead. He's getting information and acting on it within hours." "That's what we concluded," Tony said. "No," Rachel said. "What you concluded was that he has multiple sources. I'm saying something different. I'm saying the pattern of timing suggests there's a single point, one person, one channel through which multiple pieces of information are flowing. Not 2 separate sources. One relay." The room was very quiet. Dominic looked at her. "Explain." "If you have 2 independent sources, the information arrives with different lead times, different levels of detail, different gaps. What we've seen is consistent. The timing is consistent. The level of operational detail is consistent. It feels like one person who has access to multiple different things, not multiple people who each have access to one thing." She paused. "I don't know your organization well enough to tell you who that person is, but I think if you look at who had access to the reservation, the security positioning, and my mother's relocation logistics, even tangential access, even partial access, there may be an overlap you haven't found yet." Tony and Dominic looked at each other. The look lasted about 2 seconds. Tony pulled his chair out and sat down, which meant he was about to work. "Give me 4 hours," Tony said. "You have 2, Dominic said. Rachel called her mother at 4:30. Her mother's voice was sharp with worry, but intact, the specific sharpness of a woman who had raised a daughter alone and developed a particular quality of strength that didn't announce itself. "Rachel, what is happening?" "Mom, I need you to listen to me. You're going to be asked to move again this morning. I need you to go without argument." "Rachel, I know you hate this. I hate this too." Rachel pressed her free hand flat against the wall of the hallway and breathed. "But someone tried to reach you last night. They didn't get anywhere near you. The people watching over you stopped them before they got close. You were safe the entire time." She paused. "But I need you somewhere safer. Will you go?" Silence. Then, "Are you safe?" "Yes. You're not lying to me." "When have I ever lied to you about something serious?" Another silence. Her mother was thinking the particular quality of her mother's silence that meant she was separating what she wanted to say from what the situation required her to say. It was something Rachel recognized because she did it herself and had for years wondered where she'd learned it from. "Fine," her mother said. "But Rachel, when this is over, whatever this is, you're going to sit down and tell me everything. Not a summary, everything." "Deal," Rachel said. "And you're eating." "I'm eating. The people there are feeding you properly." "I made myself a sandwich yesterday." Her mother made the sound again, the not quite laugh, not quite cry, that was entirely its own thing. "Go do whatever you need to do," she said. "I love you." "I love you too," Rachel said. "Be difficult for them. It'll make you feel better." "I'm always difficult," her mother said. "It's my primary skill." Rachel hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment, with her hand still on the wall. Down the corridor, she could hear Tony's voice, low and rapid, running through something on the phone. Somewhere further in the house, she could hear the specific quality of quiet that meant Dominic was alone with something he wasn't yet ready to say out loud. She found him in the kitchen. Of course she found him in the kitchen. She was beginning to understand the room in this house where things got said that couldn't be said anywhere else, maybe because the kitchen was the one room that didn't feel like a tactical space. I was standing at the window with a coffee that had gone cold. "You should have slept," Rachel said. "You should talk," he said without turning. She got herself coffee. Fresh coffee she'd learned the machine by the second day. She came and stood near the counter and drank it and waited. "She wasn't hurt," Dominic said. He was still looking at the window. "Your mother. She was never in real danger. Our people were there before." "I know," Rachel said. "I need you to understand that the location was supposed to be Dominic." Her voice was, "I know. I'm not angry at you." He turned then, looked at her with something that she was beginning to be able to name. It was not simply guilt, though it contained guilt. It was not simply responsibility, though it contained that too. It was something older than either of those things, the expression of a man who had spent decades insulating himself from caring about outcomes beyond his own organization, who had built the insulation carefully and deliberately and with excellent materials, and who was now standing in his own kitchen at 4:30 in the morning, realizing that the insulation had a gap in it. The gap was shaped like a woman who made her own sandwiches and told him difficult truths over coffee. "I put her at risk," Dominic said. "Carbone put her at risk," Rachel said. "You gave her protection. It held." She met his eyes. "Don't spend your energy on the wrong thing right now." "What should I spend it on?" "On finding the relay point," Rachel said. "On cutting Carbone off before he realizes we've identified the pattern, and on the thing you haven't told me yet." He was quiet. "There's something else," Rachel said. "I can see it. You've been holding on to it since you walked into that situation room. What is it?" Dominic set down the cold coffee. He looked at the table for a moment, and then at her, and then he said something that she did not expect. "The accountant," he said. She waited. "His name is Gerald Marsh. He works for one of my legitimate holding companies, the property development side. 44, been with the organization 8 years. Clean, competent, invisible." Dominic paused. He was at Bellini House the night of the shooting. Not in the private room in the main dining room. Early reservation left before 9. Rachel went very still. "I didn't think anything of it," Dominic said. "He attends client dinners at Bellini regularly. It's a normal occurrence." His voice was careful, measured in the way of someone who was approaching something that made him angry and was not yet ready to arrive there. But Tony was reviewing the surveillance footage from the main dining room, not the private room, the main room, and found something. "He looked toward the private room before the shot," Rachel said. Dominic looked at her. At the restaurant, she said slowly, assembling it as she spoke. I was focused on the shooter, but I remember just before I moved toward you, just before I heard the click, there was a moment where the shooter's posture shifted, like he was looking somewhere specific. Not at you, somewhere else in the room. She set down her own cup. I saw his eyes move. I thought he was checking for clear sight lines, but the direction was wrong for the window angle. She looked at Dominic. I wasn't checking the sight lines. He was looking for confirmation. From Marsh, Dominic said. The kitchen felt colder than it had a moment ago. Marsh was the relay, Rachel said. He was in the dining room that night. He could see the security positions. He knew you were in the private room. He gave the shooter the confirmation signal. She thought about it. Which means Marsh isn't just a passive information leak. He's an active participant. He was there. He was in the room. Yes, Dominic said. And he doesn't know yet that you know. No, Dominic said. He reported to work this morning. He's been in his office for the last hour. A pause. Tony wants to bring him in immediately. Don't, Rachel said. Dominic raised an eyebrow. If you bring him in, Carbone knows within hours that his active channel has been cut. He'll activate whatever contingency he has and will be reacting again. She was moving now, thinking on her feet the same way she thought through a service floor in crisis, not to the immediate problem, but to the problem behind the problem. Marsh is the most valuable thing we have right now, not because of what he knows, because Carbone thinks he's still operational. Dominic was very still. If you can feed Carbone false information through Marsh, Rachel said, Carbone will move on it, and when he moves, you'll know exactly where he's going. The silence in the kitchen lasted long enough to become its own kind of conversation. Then Dominic said, You're describing a trap. I'm describing giving Carbone exactly what he wants, Rachel said. A target he thinks he can hit, and then not being there when he swings. And if it goes wrong, things go wrong, Rachel said evenly. The question is whether going wrong on our terms is better than continuing to react on his. Dominic looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Our terms. Rachel heard the word. She didn't break contact. I'm here, aren't I? I'm inside this. I've been inside this since the moment I heard that click. She paused. Unless you'd prefer I go back to being invisible. No, Dominic said immediately, and with a certainty that surprised both of them. The certainty sat in the kitchen between them for a moment, occupying more space than a single word should. Then Dominic pushed off the counter and said, I'll get Tony. By 7 a.m, they had the outline of a plan. Marsh would receive information carefully constructed internally, consistent, detailed, enough to be believable, indicating that Dominic was moving Rachel out of state, that the security situation had been evaluated and the decision had been made to relocate her to a property in upstate New York while the organizational restructuring continued. Specific enough for Carbone to act on. Specific enough that the action could be anticipated. Marsh would pass it on without knowing it was false. Carbone would move, and this time they would be ready. Tony laid it out in the situation room with the map and the timelines, and when he finished, he looked at Rachel and said in a voice that clearly cost him something, The operational concept is solid. Rachel looked at Tony. But it requires everything to go correctly, Tony said. In my experience, everything going correctly is not a condition we can rely on. Nothing goes correctly, Rachel said. You build redundancy. You plan for the thing that goes wrong. She paused. What's the highest probability failure point? Communication, Tony said. If Carbone has a second channel we haven't found, not through Marsh, he could receive warning that it's a setup. Can we close the window? Rachel asked. We can compress it, Tony said. Move the timeline so that Marsh receives the information and passes it on within a very short window before the operation. Less time for secondary verification. How short? 4 hours, maybe less. Then that's what we do. Rachel looked at Dominic. There's a risk. There's always a risk. The question is whether the risk of action is smaller than the risk of inaction. Dominic said, Carbone is escalating. The restaurant was one operation. Your mother was the next. He will continue escalating until he gets what he wants or someone stops him. Then we stop him, Rachel said. It was not bravado. It was arithmetic. The plan was set in motion that afternoon. What nobody planned for was what happened 4 hours later. Reed arrived at the estate at 2 in the afternoon, and the look on his face when he came through the door was one Rachel had not seen from him before, not the controlled professional exhaustion she'd become accustomed to, but something sharper than that, something urgent underneath the professional composure. "We have a problem," Reed said. "Define it," Dominic said. "Marsh is gone," Reed said. "He left his office at noon and hasn't been reachable since. Either he made us or Carbone recalled him as a precaution." He looked between Dominic and Rachel. "Either way, your information channel just closed." The room went very quiet. Rachel thought about it for exactly 30 seconds. "Did Marsh receive the information before he left?" she asked. Tony checked his phone. "He received it at 11:40. It was delivered through his normal communication channel." 20 minutes before he disappeared, Rachel said. "Yes." "Then he passed it on before he ran," Rachel said. "If he received warning that we were on to him, his first move would be to burn the channel to give Carbone one last piece of information and then go dark. It's what anyone in his position would do." She looked at Reed. "Which means Carbone has the information." "Compromised information," Dominic said slowly. "Carbone doesn't know it's compromised," Rachel said. "He knows Marsh went dark, but Marsh going dark could have a dozen explanations. And the information he received—" She stopped. "How detailed was what Marsh got?" "Very," Tony said. "Route, timing, vehicle description, departure point." "Then Carbone has a decision to make," Rachel said. "Does he trust the information and act on it knowing his relay went dark, or does he hold off and lose the window?" She paused. "What would you do?" She was looking at Dominic. He looked back at her. "If the information was detailed and internally consistent, and I had reason to believe the source was reliable, up until the moment he disappeared, I would act. Holding off means losing the advantage. In this world, advantage is not something you hold in reserve." "Then Carbone is going to move," Rachel said. "Tonight," Dominic said. "Tonight," Rachel agreed. Reed looked between them with the expression of a man watching two people think in a register. He recognized but couldn't entirely follow. The operation as planned assumed a controlled departure point and timeline. If Carbone is moving on the information Marsh had, "We need to be at the location Marsh described," Rachel said, "with enough coverage to manage whatever Carbone sends." The room erupted. Tony said it was reckless. Reed said it was operationally insane. Two of Dominic's men said things that Rachel interpreted from tone rather than word. The objections came fast and overlapping, and Rachel stood in the middle of them and waited until they ran out of steam. Then she said, I know it's not the plan, but the plan changed when Marsh went dark, and this is where we are now. We can either set the location and be there with preparation, or Carbone moves on whatever his own initiative generates, and we're reacting again." She looked at Dominic. "I'm not telling you what to do, but you asked what I thought. That's what I think." Dominic stood at the head of the table and looked at the map. Everyone waited. "We do it," Dominic said. Tony closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, then opened them and started making calls. Reed looked at Rachel with an expression that she was only beginning to learn to read, not quite respect, not quite apprehension, something that lived between those two things. "You understand," he said quietly, "that you are going to be the most visible part of this." "Someone has to be," Rachel said. "Most people," Reed said, "would not volunteer." "Most people," Rachel said, "haven't spent the last week running out of choices." The operation moved fast after that. The location from Marsh's information was an abandoned waterfront warehouse on the Jersey City side of the river. Industrial isolated the kind of space that had specific and unambiguous uses in the world. Carbone and Dominic occupied. Tony's team ran a rapid assessment of the perimeter. 2 entry points, multiple interior positions, a loading dock on the eastern side that provided cover. The plan was simple. Rachel and Dominic would arrive in the vehicle described in Marsh's information. Dominic's team would be positioned before they arrived. When Carbone's people moved, they'd move into a contained situation with exits covered on every side. Simple, clean, controlled. Except that when they arrived at the warehouse at 9:47 that night, they found that someone had gotten there first. Not Carbone's main force, a scout, a professional who had arrived hours early and had found one of Tony's team members covering the north entry point. The confrontation was quiet and fast, and ended with Tony's man down, not dead, but down, and the scout gone before anyone else registered what had happened. The radio traffic that followed was terse and alarming. "North entry is compromised," Tony's voice said in Dominic's earpiece. "We've been made. Pull back to the radio cut." Rachel heard it cut. She and Dominic were inside the building by then, in the interior of the warehouse, and the sound of the radio cutting was something she recognized at a cellular level as the sound of a situation changing shape. "Tony," Dominic said into the radio. Nothing. "Tony." Static. And then from somewhere outside the building they heard footsteps. Not one set, multiple, moving with the specific purposefulness of people who knew where they were going. Dominic moved first. He moved Rachel behind a structure of heavy industrial shelving, solid and high, and positioned himself beside her, with the controlled physicality of someone whose body knew this situation, even when his mind was still processing it. Rachel could feel his arm against hers, could hear him breathing slow, deliberate, the breathing of someone refusing to let their body decide the situation. "His team," she whispered. "Yes," Dominic said. "How bad?" A pause that told her more than words. "I don't know where Tony is. I don't have eyes on anything." Another pause. "For the first time in a long time, I do not know what happens next." Rachel heard something in his voice that she had not heard before. Not fear. Fear was too simple a word for it. It was the sound of a man who had built his entire existence on the certainty that he would always know what to do, confronting the moment when he did not. The certainty had been the foundation, and the foundation had shifted. She reached over and put her hand on his arm. Not a dramatic gesture, not romantic. The way you put your hand on someone's arm to tell them you are present, and they are not alone, and the situation has not eliminated everything. He looked at her. She looked back, and then she heard it. The footsteps paused. A door somewhere on the east side of the building shifted on its hinges. A body moved into a new position. And then, in the specific and unmistakable quality of a person preparing to fire a small metallic sound, click. Rachel's entire body responded before her conscious mind gave the instruction. She turned to Dominic. "Keep still," she whispered. His eyes changed. I understood immediately. He dropped, pulling her with him behind the heaviest section of the shelving, both of them flat against the floor, and the shot that came 3 seconds later punched through the space where they had been standing and buried itself in the far wall. Then everything happened at once, from 3 different positions outside the building. Dominic's team, which had not been eliminated, had been repositioned, had been moving this entire time, came through the entry points with the coordinated force of people who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Reed's people, who had held back 2 blocks as a second layer, moved in from the exterior. The warehouse became a contained operation in 90 seconds. Rachel lay on the concrete floor and breathed. Dominic was beside her. He was breathing too harder than usual. The composure cracked all the way through in a way she hadn't seen before, and suspected very few people ever had. "You heard it again," he said. "Yes," Rachel said. "The same sound. The same sound." He looked at the ceiling of the warehouse for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "You just saved my life for the second time." "We're going to stop counting," Rachel said, "or it's going to get embarrassing." Somewhere outside, she could hear Reed's voice directing the situation. She could hear Tony. Tony was alive. Tony was operational. Tony's radio had been jammed, but Tony himself had not been stopped. She could hear the specific quality of a situation being resolved, contained, concluded. But Dominic was looking at her with an expression that had moved entirely beyond the mask. He had been considering something for a long time. She could see it in his face. The way you could see someone arriving at a destination they had been traveling toward without knowing it. "When this is over," Dominic said, and then stopped. "When this is over," Rachel said, waiting. "I'm going to do something I should have done a long time ago," he said. "Something that is going to cost me most of what I've built." He looked at her steadily. "And I need you to know that it has nothing to do with you. I'm not doing it because of you. I'm doing it because you showed me something I had stopped being willing to see." Rachel looked at him. The warehouse was loud around them, voices, movement, resolution. But between the 2 of them, it was very quiet. "What did I show you?" she said. "That there's a difference," Dominic said, "between a man who controls his life and a man who is controlled by it." He paused. "I haven't been the first kind in a long time." Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" and Dominic told her. She listened to the full shape of it, what he had been accumulating, what he had been building toward what the evidence that Carbone had forced him to compile had revealed not just about Carbone, but about Dominic's own organization, his own years, his own choices. The cost of what he was describing was not abstract. It was real and immediate and large, and he knew it with the absolute clarity of someone who has stopped negotiating with himself. Rachel listened to all of it. Then she said, "Reed is outside." "I know," Dominic said. "He's going to want to know what happened in here tonight." "I know. Are you ready?" Dominic looked at the ceiling one more time. Then he stood. He reached down and offered Rachel his hand, and she took it, and he pulled her to her feet with the careful steadiness of someone who understood the difference between offering help and exerting control. "No," he said honestly, "but I'm going to do it anyway." They walked toward the warehouse door together, and outside in the cold air of the Jersey City waterfront with Reed's lights and Dominic's team and the sound of a situation arriving at its conclusion, Vincent Carbone's operation collapsed in real-time arrests. Communications cut the architecture of 30 years of calculated leverage, beginning to fall inward in the specific way of structures that look solid until the foundational choice is made to stop holding them up. Dominic had made the choice, in a warehouse on the floor with Rachel Bennett's voice in his ear saying the same 2 words she'd said the first night she'd ever seen him. "Keep still." And for the first time in 30 years, keeping still had led somewhere entirely different than he expected. Reed looked at Dominic for a long time before he said anything. They were standing outside the warehouse at 10:23 at night, and the cold air off the river was doing the thing. Cold air does when a situation has just resolved itself, filling the space where noise and urgency had been with something quieter and heavier. Dominic's team was managing the perimeter. 2 of Carbone's men were in custody. A 3rd had been transported by ambulance. Tony was on the phone 15 feet away, his back turned, his voice too low to hear but his posture communicating everything. Rachel stood slightly apart from both of them. She had her arms crossed over her chest, not defensively, but in the way of someone who is cold and is not going to say so. She was watching Reed's face. She had learned that Reed's face, unlike Dominic's, didn't entirely cooperate with Reed's professional intentions. The professional layer was solid. But underneath it, if you paid attention, you could read the actual response moving like weather behind glass. What she read right now was a man confronting something he had not expected to confront tonight. "You want to talk to me?" Reed said to Dominic. It was not a question. "Yes," Dominic said, "in an official capacity." "Yes." Reed looked at Rachel, then back at Dominic. "Tonight." "Tonight," Dominic said, "before I change my mind. Not because I'm likely to change my mind, but because in my experience, the longer a decision like this sits, the more architecture builds up around it, and I have spent 30 years building architecture around decisions I should have made differently." He paused. "I would rather do this while the architecture is still down." Reed studied him for another moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone and made a call that took 45 seconds and involved very few words, most of which were logistical. When he hung up, he looked at Rachel. "This next part," Reed said, "is going to be complicated." "Everything so far has been complicated," Rachel said. "This is a different kind of complicated." Reed's voice had a quality she recognized, the particular gentleness of someone who was about to tell you something you needed to hear and was trying to find the angle that minimized unnecessary damage. If Dominic cooperates and cooperates fully, which is what any arrangement of this kind requires, it will involve disclosure of activities that implicate not just Carbone's organization, but his own. People in his organization. Business conducted over many years. He paused. That creates legal exposure, for Dominic personally, for people connected to him. "I understand that," Dominic said. "Do you—" Reed's voice sharpened slightly. "Because understanding it in principle, and understanding it when it's your name on the documents and your history being reviewed, and your lawyers telling you what the next several years of your life look like, those are different experiences." "Reed," Dominic said, "I have spent 30 years making decisions that I understood exactly. I knew what each one cost, I knew what each one built, and I made them with complete awareness of what I was choosing." He looked at the older man steadily. "I am telling you that I am prepared to make this decision with the same completeness, including the cost." The river was dark behind them. Somewhere across the water, Manhattan's lights reflected off the surface in long, broken lines. Reed looked at Dominic, then he looked at Rachel. Rachel met his eyes and said nothing. This was not her moment to fill. This was a moment that required the space it was taking up. "All right," Reed said. "My car, now. We do a preliminary conversation tonight, and tomorrow morning we bring in the prosecutors." He started moving, then stopped, looked back at Rachel. "Miss Bennett, what you did tonight, what you did that first night, and every night in between, I want you to know that I understand what it cost." Rachel considered that. "I'm not sure you do," she said, "but I appreciate you saying it." Reed nodded once and got in his car. Dominic turned to Rachel. He looked at her with the specific quality of a man who has many things to say and has organized them and is now going to say only the most important one. "Go back to the estate," he said. "Tony will take you. Sleep." A pause. "I mean that literally, not as a dismissal. You've been running on 4 hours for 3 days." "I'm aware," Rachel said. "And Rachel," he stopped. The mask was down entirely, completely, in a way she suspected almost no one in his life had ever seen. "What you said in the warehouse, about the difference between controlling your life and being controlled by it." He paused. "I've been thinking about that longer than tonight, since the first morning in the kitchen, since the conversation about Patterson." He paused again. "I don't know how to say thank you for that." "You just did," Rachel said. "That's not what Dominic." She said his name the way she said things she meant completely, without softening it, without apology. "You said thank you. I heard it. Now go talk to Reed before the architecture builds back up." The corner of his mouth moved. Then he turned and walked to Reed's car. Rachel stood on the waterfront and watched the car's taillights disappear. Then she found Tony, who was standing by the SUV with the expression of a man who had processed many different kinds of evenings in his career and was placing this one in a category that did not yet have a name. "Take me back," she said. "Yes," Tony said. And then quietly as she got in, "He's going to be all right." Rachel looked at him. "I know," she said. Tony drove. She slept in the back seat. Not the restless negotiation of the last several nights, but actual sleep, the kind that arrived without announcement, because the body had simply decided it was done, waiting for permission. She woke up when the SUV stopped. The estate was quiet. She went inside, went to the kitchen, out of habit, made tea instead of coffee, because it was 11:30 and she had some intention of sleeping again, and sat at the kitchen table with both hands around the mug and allowed herself for the first time since the first click to simply be still. Not the stillness of waiting for something to happen, the stillness of something having happened. She thought about the restaurant, the specific weight of a double shift, the texture of the white uniform, the way the private room's lighting had been set for an intimate dinner for one powerful man. She thought about seeing the badge that said David on a man whose movements didn't match his supposed role. She thought about the click and what the click had set in motion, and how the chain of consequence from that single sound had reached all the way to a waterfront warehouse where a man she'd known for less than a week had decided to dismantle the world he'd built. She tried to map the logic of it and couldn't. There wasn't logic. There was a series of moments, each one arriving without warning, each one requiring a specific response, and the responses had accumulated into something that looked from the outside like it must have been planned. It hadn't been planned. It had been paid attention to. That was the only difference between Rachel Bennett and anyone else who had been in that restaurant that night. She had paid attention. She finished her tea and went to sleep. The next morning, Tony came to find her at 7:15 with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. It took her a moment to identify it because it was not an expression Tony deployed often. It was something close to uncertain. "Dominic called," Tony said. Rachel waited. "I was with Reed until 4 in the morning," Tony said. "Prosecutors were brought in at 6. It's moving fast, faster than I expected." He sat down at the kitchen table across from her, which was unusual. Tony rarely sat in the kitchen. The scope of what he's disclosing, Rachel, it's not just Carbone. It's operations going back 15 years, people within our own organization, business arrangements that it touches everything. He looked at his hands. "I've been with him for 22 years. I have never seen him do anything that I would describe as unexpected." He paused. "This is unexpected. Is he?" "Is it?" Rachel said. Tony looked at her. "You told me yourself," Rachel said. He hasn't really laughed in a long time, not the kind that happens because something is actually funny. She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. A man who has been doing the same thing for 30 years, the same calculations, the same architecture, the same rules, and then something interrupts the pattern, not breaks it, interrupts it, gives him enough space to see it from the outside. She paused. He was ready. He just needed something to stop him long enough to recognize it. Tony was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He asked me to check on you." "I'm fine." "He knew you'd say that." Something almost like warmth moved across Tony's face. "He said to tell you that he knows you're fine and that he's asking anyway." Rachel looked at her coffee. "Tell him," she said, "that I made myself breakfast and the eggs were better than the hospital coffee." Tony looked at her for a moment. Then he took out his phone. He actually sent the message. 40 minutes later, Dominic responded. Tony held the phone out to Rachel. The message said, "The bar for better than hospital coffee is very low. I need more information." Rachel took the phone, typed, "They were scrambled. I found chives. Respectable considering the circumstances." 3 minutes passed. Then, "When this is done, I'll get you a better kitchen." Rachel looked at that for a moment. Then she typed, "I have a kitchen. I'm working on it." She handed the phone back to Tony. Tony read the exchange. His expression did the thing it had been doing recently, the almost warmth that arrived and then tried to pretend it hadn't. "He's not good at this," Tony said. "At what? At whatever this is." He gestured vaguely. "Nobody is at first," Rachel said. "That's not a problem. That's just where you start." The days that followed were not quiet, but they had a different quality from the days before, not the urgency of active threat, but the sustained grinding work of legal proceedings, organizational disruption, and consequence. Reed called Rachel twice to give her updates that she didn't strictly require, but that she understood he was offering because he felt she had earned them. Carbone's organization began to collapse in stages. First, the financial infrastructure, which froze in 3 separate jurisdictions over 48 hours, and then the personnel, as the people who had been operating on Carbone's payroll made calculations about their own futures, and the majority of those calculations resulted in cooperation. Carbone himself was taken into federal custody on a Tuesday morning 7 days after the warehouse. Reed called Rachel to tell her. She was at the estate kitchen making coffee. "It's done," Reed said. Rachel set the coffee pot down. "The primary federal charges alone carry a mandatory minimum that will occupy him for the rest of his functional life," Reed said. "And we're still building." The financial records Dominic provided Rachel. It's not an exaggeration to say that this is the most significant organized crime prosecution on the East Coast in 20 years. Rachel was quiet for a moment. "How is Dominic?" she said. "In meetings," Reed said. "He's been in meetings for 6 straight days. His lawyers, the prosecutors, 2 different federal agencies, and the Organized Crime Task Force." A pause. "He's navigating it. Better than I expected, honestly. He understands what he's responsible for. He's not trying to minimize it." Another pause. "That's rarer than you'd think." "I know," Rachel said. "He asked about you," Reed said. "Yesterday. In the middle of a 7-hour session with prosecutors, he stopped and asked me how you were doing." Rachel closed her eyes briefly. "What did you tell him?" she said. "The truth," Reed said. "That you were fine, that you'd made eggs, and that you'd started looking into something about a small business license in Jersey City." Rachel opened her eyes. "You've been checking on me." "It's my job," Reed said, and then after a pause, "and you saved my case, twice by my count, possibly 3 times. He cleared his throat, which was the closest Reed came to expressing emotion through his voice. "The small business license, is that—" "A restaurant," Rachel said. "Small, neighborhood, nothing dramatic." She paused. "I've been thinking about it for a while, years actually. There was always something else that needed doing first." "And now," Reed said. "Now," Rachel said, "I'm running out of reasons to put it last." Reed was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good," he said, simply and completely. "Good." The legal process moved with a speed that surprised people who didn't understand that federal prosecutors with complete financial records and a cooperative witness of Dominic's scope had very little reason to move slowly. By 3 weeks after the warehouse, the framework of Dominic's cooperation agreement was in place. It was not an amnesty. Rachel had been clear with herself that she would not romanticize what it was. It was an accounting. An acknowledgement of 20 years of choices that had consequences and could not be unmade. What it offered was not forgiveness. It offered the possibility of a future that was not entirely defined by the past. Dominic called her himself for the first time on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks and 2 days after the warehouse, not through Tony, directly. She picked up on the second ring. "Rachel," he said. "Dominic," she said. A pause. The specific quality of a pause between two people who have been in a warehouse together and in a kitchen together and at the edge of several different kinds of danger together and are now speaking on a telephone from different locations for the first time. "How are you?" he said. "I'm fine," she said. "Actually fine, not the way I say fine to make people stop asking." "I can tell the difference now," he said. "I know you can," she said. Another pause. "The agreement is it's moving in the direction it needs to move. There will be consequences, real ones. There are things I've built that won't survive this. Organizations, arrangements, certain business relationships." His voice was even. "My lawyers are managing the legitimate companies separately. Most of them will continue. The other parts..." A pause. "The other parts are gone. I made that choice when I walked to Reed's car." "I know," Rachel said. "I need you to know that I don't regret it. I believe you. I'm not saying it to..." He stopped. "I'm not asking you to validate it. I'm telling you because you are the person who was there when I decided, and that means you are the person I want to tell." Rachel sat with that for a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." "How is the restaurant?" he said, and the shift was deliberate, a step sideways into something that didn't require either of them to hold quite so much weight. "It's a small business license application right now," Rachel said. "It will be a restaurant, eventually." "I'd like to help," Dominic said, and then before she could respond, "I know what you're about to say." "Do you? You're going to tell me that you don't need my help and that you intend to do it on your own terms and that accepting anything from me creates an obligation that changes the nature of..." "I was going to say," Rachel said, "that I'd appreciate it if you didn't." A pause. "The money part," she clarified. "The financing. I have savings. I have a loan application. I want it to be mine, built on what I built, not what you gave me. That matters to me. Not because I'm proud, but because this restaurant is something I've been putting last for years while I took care of everything else. I need to know I did it myself." "I understand," Dominic said. He said it simply without argument, which told her he actually did. "But," Rachel said. He was quiet, waiting. "There are things I can't buy," she said. "I've been researching suppliers, good ones, the kind of relationships that take years to build. Fresh produce quality importers, reliable dairy. For a first-time owner with no track record, those relationships are the hardest thing to get." "I know people," Dominic said. "I know you know people," Rachel said. "I'm asking you to introduce me, not to do it for me. Introduce me. I'll handle the rest." A pause. Then very quietly, "You're asking me to open a door, and then stand out of the way while I walk through it," Rachel said. Dominic was quiet for long enough that she almost said something else. Then he said, "Yes. Yes, you'll do it, or yes, you understand the distinction." "Both," he said. Rachel exhaled a breath she hadn't entirely known she was holding. "Good," she said. "Then we have an arrangement." "We have an arrangement," Dominic agreed. Another pause. This one had a different texture from the others, not weighted with unsaid things, but with something that had been said and had landed correctly and was now settling into its appropriate place. "Rachel," Dominic said. "Yes. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, not the version that protects me from the answer." "When have I ever protected you from an answer?" she said. Something moved in his voice, almost a laugh. Almost. "Fair point." He paused. "What are you doing this for? The restaurant, the license, all of it? You could have gone back after Carbone was taken in, after the threat was neutralized. You could have gone back to Bellini House, back to the apartment, back to your life as it was. You had a reason for every delay. But I think you stayed because you chose to stay, not because circumstances required it." Rachel was quiet for a moment. She looked at the kitchen. She was sitting in the estate kitchen, which she had made her own over 3 weeks of early mornings and late evenings by rearranging things incrementally until the space worked the way she thought spaces should work. "Someone asked me a question," she said. "About a week after the shooting, in this kitchen, over a sandwich." "I remember the sandwich," Dominic said. The question was, what would I choose if nobody needed anything from me? She paused. I couldn't answer it. That frightened me. I've been thinking about it every day since. Another pause. The restaurant is the answer. Not because nobody needs anything from me. My mother needs things from me that's not going to stop. But it's the first thing in a long time that I'm doing because I want it. Because I can see it clearly in my mind and it's mine, and I want to build it. Dominic was quiet. You should know, Rachel said, that I'm aware of what that question cost you to ask, given that you were in the middle of your own version of the same crisis. I was, Dominic said. Did you answer it for yourself? A long pause, the kind that meant the answer existed, but the words for it were still being located. I think, Dominic said slowly, that I'm in the process of answering it. The answer isn't a single thing. It's a series of mornings where I make choices that are mine, not the situation's. He paused. Today I had a meeting with my lawyers that went until 2 p.m. When it ended, I walked for an hour. Just walked. No destination. No security. Tony nearly had an aneurysm. Rachel felt something warm move through her chest. Tony's fine, she said. Tony is never fine, Dominic said with something that was unmistakably dry amusement. But he's useful. He cares about you, Rachel said. I know, Dominic said. I've known for 22 years. I haven't always been as I haven't always acknowledged it as well as I should have. There's time, Rachel said. Yes, Dominic said. There is. The conversation ended 20 minutes later with the comfortable incompleteness of a conversation between two people who know they will pick it up again. Not a conclusion. A pause. Rachel sat at the kitchen table after she hung up and thought about time. She had spent 11 years at Bellini House learning to be invisible, learning to anticipate what others needed before they needed it to smooth every friction, to be the competent, reliable presence that everyone depended on and no one particularly saw. It had not been a bad life. It had been a life built around other people's needs, which is one way of living and not the worst way. But the question Dominic had asked her kept returning, what would you choose if nobody needed anything from you? And the answer she was beginning to understand was not that she wanted to stop caring about people, or stop being useful, or stop being the person who noticed things others missed. Those were not burdens she wanted to put down, they were simply herself. The answer was that she wanted to choose the context. She wanted to build the room that her attention and her care and her noticing happened inside of. Not a room someone else had built and invited her into. Her own room, with her own tables and her own kitchen. And she was going to do it herself. She picked up the small business license application she'd been working on for the last 3 days and spread it on the table and found the pen she kept by the coffee maker and kept working. 2 floors up in a room at the other end of the estate, Tony Russo sat in the dark with the lights of the city visible through the window and called his sister for the first time in 4 months. She answered on the 3rd ring surprised, and then not surprised the way families are when someone they love calls unexpectedly. The surprise is at the call, not at the love. Tony, she said. Yeah, he said. It's me. Are you all right? Yeah, he said. I think yeah. He paused. I just wanted to call. His sister, who knew him the way only people who have known you your whole life know you didn't ask for an explanation. I'm glad you did, she said. Tell me something, Tony said. Something from your life, nothing dramatic, just something. She told him about her garden, about the tomatoes she was growing this year for the first time, about the specific difficulty of tomatoes in the Northeast climate, about her neighbor who had given her advice, and the advice that had worked, and the advice that had not. Tony listened. He listened the way a man listens who has been too busy for a long time to listen to anything that didn't require a response, and was only now remembering that some things just needed to be heard. I didn't know Rachel was downstairs doing paperwork. She didn't know he was upstairs on the phone, but in the kitchen the light was still on. And on the table next to the small business license application and the coffee she'd made at 9 and was still drinking at 11, there was a notebook. And in the notebook, in Rachel's handwriting, the handwriting of someone who had spent years keeping precise notes on tables and orders, and the small details that mattered, there was a list. At the top of the list, in letters she'd pressed into the page, with the particular deliberateness of someone committing to something real, Bennett House. Below it, the details were accumulating. Menu concepts, neighborhood research, supplier contacts she was going to pursue herself, a rough floor plan, a cost breakdown so precise it would have made a banker nervous at how carefully she had done the arithmetic. Notes about the kind of restaurant she wanted. Not exclusive, not expensive, not the kind of place that made people feel they needed to be something they weren't before they walked through the door. Neighborhood. Real. The kind of place where someone could come alone on a Tuesday and be treated like a person who mattered. She wrote for 2 hours. Outside, the night moved toward morning. And in the distance across the river, Vincent Carbone sat in a federal holding facility and thought about the waitress and the decision he had made 3 weeks ago, the decision to call her a loose end, to make her a target, to believe that the way to destabilize Dominic Valenti was to threaten what Dominic Valenti cared about. He had been right about the logic. He had been wrong about the woman. He had assumed that threatening someone would make them smaller, would push them toward safety, toward retreat, toward the particular kind of silence that people choose when they understand what they're up against. He had not considered that some people, when they understand what they're up against, simply pay closer attention. Carbone sat with that and looked at the wall of a federal holding cell and understood with the cold clarity of a man who had built his career on reading people that he had made a fundamental error. He had seen Rachel Bennett as a variable. She had never been a variable. She had been from the first moment she heard the click, the one constant that everything else had turned on. And it was far too late in every sense to do anything about it. Back at the estate, Rachel capped her pen, closed the notebook, took her coffee mug to the sink, rinsed it, set it on the rack, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. She slept immediately. She did not dream about the restaurant or the warehouse or the shooting or any of the things that had happened in the last several weeks. She dreamed about something ordinary. Her mother's kitchen, a Sunday morning, the smell of coffee and the sound of the radio and the specific quality of light through a window she had looked through for the first 20 years of her life. She woke up at 6:30, feeling for the first time in longer than she could precisely identify entirely like herself. 6 months after the warehouse, Rachel Bennett failed her first health inspection. Not badly, not catastrophically. 2 violations: a temperature reading on the prep cooler that came in 2 degrees above code, and a ventilation issue above the secondary cooking station that the inspector flagged with the specific enthusiasm of someone who had spent his career finding things that other people had missed. He was thorough and not unkind about it, and he told Rachel exactly what needed to be corrected, and exactly when he would return to verify, and she thanked him and closed the door behind him, and stood in the middle of her not-yet-open restaurant and breathed. Her mother called 20 minutes later. Rachel had not told her about the inspection. "You failed something," her mother said by way of greeting. Rachel looked at the ceiling. "How do you know?" "You have a specific silence when something goes wrong that you're already fixing. I've known that silence since you were 9 years old." A pause. "How bad?" "2 violations. Correctable. Reinspection in 2 weeks." Rachel sat down at one of the tables, her table's chairs she had selected herself from a supplier in Hoboken, who had given her a good price because Tony had made a phone call and she had walked through the door and made the deal herself. "I'm not spiraling." "I know you're not. You don't spiral. You recalibrate." Her mother's voice had the warmth of someone who has watched a person be themselves for long enough to find even the difficult parts beautiful. "Call the ventilation company today. Don't put it off." "I already have the number pulled up." "Of course you do." A pause. "Come for dinner Sunday. I'm making the pot roast." "I'll be there," Rachel said. She hung up, called the ventilation company, scheduled the repair for Thursday, documented everything in the folder she kept specifically for inspection compliance, and then made herself a coffee and sat back down at the table and looked at the restaurant, her restaurant. Bennett House was not large. It seated 42. She had counted the number, carefully had drawn the floor plan 11 times before she arrived at the configuration that felt right, that allowed the room to breathe without feeling empty when it wasn't full. The tables were simple and solid. The lighting was warm without being theatrical. The kitchen was compact and precisely organized because Rachel had designed it herself, and she designed the way she worked every element in its correct position, every process running in the right sequence, nothing decorative that didn't also serve a function. It was not Bellini House. It was not trying to be Bellini House. It was something she had built from a notebook entry and a small business loan and 3 years of savings and 6 months of the most intensive work she had ever done in her life, which was considerable given that her entire adult life had been intensive work. She had hired 4 staff. She had interviewed 11. She had made her selections based on a combination of skill and the specific quality that she recognized in people. The quality of genuine attention, the ability to read a room, the willingness to care about the details that customers noticed without knowing they were noticing them. 2 of her 4 staff had previously worked at restaurants that had closed. One had been a caregiver for a parent for 3 years and was returning to the workforce. One was 23 and had never worked a restaurant in his life, but had answered her question about how he handled a complicated situation with an honesty so complete and unpolished that she had hired him on the spot. The opening was in 6 days. She had 6 days to pass the reinspection, finalize the menu, train her staff to the standards she required, manage the supplier relationships she had built herself over the last 4 months, and do it all without losing the specific quality of calm that was not the absence of feeling, but the management of it. She finished her coffee, got up, and got back to work. The reinspection came on a Tuesday. The inspector arrived at 9:15 and was thorough in the same way he'd been thorough the first time. Rachel walked with him, answered his questions directly, pointed out the corrections before he asked about them. He checked the cooler temperature within code. He examined the ventilation correct. He went through his checklist with the systematic patience of someone who understood that the checklist existed for good reasons. He signed the approval at 10:40. Rachel shook his hand. When he left, she stood in the kitchen and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of something she identified as joy. Not triumph. Joy was quieter than triumph and more specific. It arrived in the chest rather than the head, and had a particular quality of completeness that triumph in her experience rarely did. 30 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and called her most reliable prep supplier to confirm the Thursday delivery. Tony arrived 2 days before the opening. He appeared at the door of Bennett House at 11 in the morning with no announcement, wearing a jacket that was slightly less formal than his usual, carrying a box that he handed to Rachel without explanation. Rachel opened it. Inside was a set of kitchen timers, 8 of them different sizes, professional grade, the kind that didn't lose accuracy over heat and heavy use. She looked at the timers. She looked at Tony. "You can't run a kitchen without timers," Tony said. "I looked it up." Rachel looked at the timers again. They were extremely good timers. "Thank you, Tony," she said. "They're practical," Tony said. "It's not sentimental." "I know," Rachel said. Tony came inside and looked at the restaurant with the expression he used when he was assessing a space for security vulnerabilities, which she understood by now was simply how Tony looked at rooms. After a moment, his expression shifted into something else, something that was not assessment. "It's good," he said. "It looks like you." Rachel considered that. "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation," Tony said. "Yes." He stayed for coffee. They sat at one of the tables and talked about nothing urgent, his sister's tomatoes, which had apparently come in well despite the difficult season. A film he had watched the previous week that he had opinions about. The specific frustrations of a construction project on the road between the estate and the highway that had added 12 minutes to every commute for 3 months. Rachel listened and contributed, and noticed that Tony was doing the thing he had not done when she first met him, the thing that involved being present in a conversation rather than monitoring it, the thing that involved talking to someone rather than managing them. She didn't comment on it, she just let it be what it was. When he left, he paused at the door and turned back. "He's coming," Tony said. "Opening night. He wanted me to tell you directly rather than through a message, but he also didn't want to call because he thought you might tell him not to." Rachel crossed her arms. "He's not wrong about that." "He knows," Tony said. "He asked me to tell you that he would understand if you'd rather he didn't come, and that he's coming anyway unless you tell him not to." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Tell him," she said, "that I'll have a table for him, not the best one." Tony's face did something she had come to recognize as his version of a smile. "I'll pass that along." The night before the opening, Rachel stayed late. Her staff had gone home. The suppliers had delivered. The kitchen was stocked and organized to her specification. The tables were set. The lighting was adjusted. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared, and the only thing remaining was the opening itself, which would arrive whether she was ready or not. She sat at the bar alone with a glass of water and looked at the room. She thought about what it had taken to get here, not in the dramatic sense, not the shooting and the warehouse and Carbone. Those things had happened and they had changed things, and she was not going to pretend they hadn't. But she thought about what had been here before any of that. The 11 years of double shifts. The money saved carefully, $20 at a time, in a way that was invisible to everyone except her. The notebook she'd kept for 4 years with the restaurant plans that she'd never shown anyone because showing them would have made them real, and making them real would have made failing them devastating. She had been protecting the dream by hiding it. What she understood now, sitting in the room that the dream had become, was that the protection had also been starving it. You couldn't build something and keep it invisible at the same time. At some point, you had to let the thing be seen. You had to let it stand in the light and risk being exactly what it was. One tiny click had started all of it. Not the click of the gun at Bellini House, though that had been the catalyst. The first click, the internal one, the one that happened when Rachel heard the sound and connected it to a conclusion and moved toward it instead of away. The click of her own choosing, fast and irrevocable. She had been making choices like that her entire life. She just hadn't been making them for herself. She finished her water, turned off the lights, locked the door, and went home to sleep. Opening night arrived on a Friday. The dinner service started at 6. By 5:45, every reservation had been confirmed. By 6:10, every table was occupied. Rachel moved through the dining room with the same mechanism she had always used, reading the room, anticipating needs, connecting what she saw to what was required. But now the room was hers, and the connection ran differently. Not as a service performed for someone else's establishment, as the expression of something she had built with complete deliberateness. Her mother arrived at 6:30 and sat at the table Rachel had specifically reserved, not the best table, not the most prominent, but the one with the best sightline to the entire room, because her mother had spent 30 years watching Rachel work from angles that allowed her to see her daughter without being seen herself, and Rachel had designed this one intentionally. Her mother sat down, looked at the room, looked at Rachel, crossing from the kitchen to a table on the east side, and did not cry. She pressed her lips together in the particular way she had when crying was the truthful response, and she had decided to hold it differently. She ordered the pasta, Rachel's pasta, a recipe she had been developing for 8 months, the thing she was most proud of on the menu, and she ate it slowly and carefully. And when Rachel passed her table, she looked up and said only, "Rachel, this is extraordinary." Rachel said, "Thank you, Mom," and kept moving because the room needed her. Detective Reed arrived at 7:15. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the dining room with the expression of a man who had spent his career observing situations and was now observing one that required a different kind of attention than usual. He was wearing a jacket that was slightly nicer than his usual, and his tie was straight, both of which Rachel registered and interpreted as the kind of effort that meant something. She went to the door. "Detective Reed." "Miss Bennett." He looked at the room again. "You built this." "I built this," she confirmed. "It looks—" He stopped, found the word. "Earned," he said. Rachel considered that. "That's exactly the right word," she said. She took him to a table near the window. He ordered the branzino, which made her almost laugh, and she managed not to. Tony arrived at 7:45 and sat at a table near the back that provided Rachel noticed a clear sight line to both entrances and the kitchen door. She brought him a menu without comment, and he ordered without deliberation, which meant he had already decided what he wanted before he arrived, which she suspected meant he had looked up the menu online, which she was genuinely touched by. At 8:10, the door opened. No convoy, no security visible though. Rachel understood that invisible security and no security were not the same thing. Just Dominic Valenti in a dark jacket, his hands at his sides, standing in the doorway of a 42-seat neighborhood restaurant in Jersey City, looking like a man who was somewhere he had chosen to be rather than somewhere his position required him to be. The difference was in how he held his shoulders. Rachel had learned to read shoulders. She crossed the dining room to the door. He looked at her. She looked at him. 18 months had moved across both of them in ways that were visible if you knew how to look. He was slightly less composed, not less controlled, but less armored, as if he had spent 18 months making the deliberate decision to not put certain things back on after he'd taken them off. She was slightly more present, not louder, not more visible in the way of someone who had learned to perform visibility, but genuinely there, genuinely occupying the room she was in. "Reservation," Rachel said. Dominic looked at the dining room, at the tables, at the people eating her food in the restaurant she had built. "No," he said. "That could be a problem. I know the owner." "Everyone says that," Rachel said, and Dominic Valenti laughed, not the almost laugh she had been cataloging for months, not the micro-movement at the corner of his mouth that represented the door opening a crack. A real laugh, surprised and genuine and entirely without calculation, the kind that arrived because something was actually funny, and the body responded before the mind decided whether to allow it. It lasted only a moment, but it was real. Rachel gave him a table. Not the best one, the one by the window, which had a clear view of the street, and also she did not mention the best acoustics in the room, quieter than the others, slightly removed a table where a conversation could be had without the dining room listening to it. He noticed all of this immediately. Of course he did. "You planned this," he said when she seated him. "I plan everything," Rachel said. "Do you want to see a menu, or do you already know what you want?" "I already know what you're going to recommend," he said. "Do you?" "The pasta," he said. "You spent 8 months on it, Tony told me." "Tony talks too much," Rachel said. "Tony has never talked this much in 22 years, Dominic said. "It's an unusual development." He looked at her steadily. "He's happier." Rachel held the menu for a moment. "So are you," she said. Dominic was quiet, not the composed quiet of a man maintaining control, the quiet of a man who had arrived somewhere and was taking a moment to recognize it. "Yes," he said, "I am." She brought him the pasta. She gave him the full service, not the deferential, invisible service of Bellini House, but the genuine attention of a host who understood what each person at each table needed and provided it as a matter of real care rather than professional performance. She moved through the room, and the room moved with her, the way a room moves when the person running it knows exactly what they're doing and does it from something that looks like love for the work. Her mother watched from her table. Reed ate his branzino and made notes in the small notebook he apparently carried everywhere, which Rachel suspected was not about the food. Tony sat near the back and watched the room with the particular quality of a man who was not watching the room for threats for the first time in his professional life and was not entirely sure what to do with his hands as a result. At 9:30, the dinner service slowed into the comfortable final hour. The kitchen was maintaining. The staff was performing exactly as she had trained them, not perfectly, because nothing performed perfectly, but well and genuinely, and with the care she had looked for when she hired them. Rachel sat across from Dominic at his table. She did this consciously. She could have sent a staff member to check on him. She chose to sit. "Tell me something," she said. He looked at her, waiting. "What you chose," she said. "When this is finished, when the legal process is done, and whatever comes next has settled, what did you choose?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "The legitimate companies," he said. "Property development. 3 of the logistics operations that were always clean. A board position at one of the nonprofits, genuinely not as a cover." He paused. "Reed's team will be part of my life for several more years in a monitoring capacity. I understand that, and I have accepted it without resentment. It is a consequence, not a punishment." "And personally," Rachel said. He looked at her. "I'm learning," he said, "what it feels like to make a decision and have it be mine entirely, without the weight of an organization's expectations behind it, without the logic of a world that required specific responses to specific situations." He paused. "It is unfamiliar, in a way that I am choosing to find interesting rather than threatening." "That's the right choice," Rachel said. "It is a daily practice," he said, "not a conclusion." "Most things are," Rachel said. The kitchen made a sound, a small familiar sound, a bottle being opened, a cork being drawn, the specific acoustic signature of a wine being poured somewhere behind them. Click. The sound was quiet and ordinary and entirely what it was. But for half a second, both Rachel and Dominic went completely still. They looked at each other. Rachel felt it first, the laugh arriving from somewhere deep and genuine, from the part of herself that had spent the last 18 months discovering that she was allowed to find things funny, that humor was not a luxury she needed to postpone until all the difficult things were finished. She started laughing. Dominic looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he started laughing too. Not the careful amusement she had first seen at Bellini House. Not the surprised laugh from the doorway tonight. Something that moved all the way through him, that came from the recognition of something true and absurd and entirely theirs. A wine bottle. an ordinary Friday evening. The sound that had once meant death, meaning nothing, except that someone was opening a bottle of wine. They laughed for a moment that was longer than it needed to be, and exactly as long as it should be. Rachel's mother across the room looked up at the sound. She saw her daughter laughing at a table with a man she had heard enough about over the last 18 months to have formed complex opinions, and she watched, and the expression on her face was the expression of a woman who has watched someone she loves carry an enormous weight for a very long time and is now watching them set some of it down. She picked up her wine glass and looked back at her own table. Reed across the room heard the laughter and looked up briefly and then looked back at his notebook. He wrote one word. Then he closed the notebook and finished his branzino. Tony near the back heard the laughter and looked at the table by the window and saw what was there to see. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone who has spent 22 years watching a person live in a specific way and is now watching them begin to live differently. He looked at it long enough to know what he was seeing. Then he signaled a member of staff for more bread and looked away, giving the moment the privacy it deserved. Later, after the last customers left and the staff had gone home and the kitchen had been closed with the deliberate care of someone who understood that how you ended a thing mattered as much as how you began it. Rachel stood in her empty dining room. Dominic had offered to stay and help close. She had told him no. He had understood immediately this part was hers alone, the closing of the first night, the private accounting of what had happened and what it meant. She moved through the room the way she had moved through dining rooms for 11 years, straightening chairs, checking tables, the small rituals of the end of a service that were mechanical enough to occupy the hands while the mind did what it needed to do. She thought about the first time she'd heard the click, the sound that had interrupted everything, the sound that had forced her to stop being invisible. She had spent a long time believing that her value was in her usefulness to others, that the measure of her life was how many problems she had solved, for how many people, how many shifts she had worked, how many things she had held together that would have fallen apart without her. And those things were real, the value in them was real. She did not regret the years of caring for her mother, of working double shifts, of being the person others depended on. But she understood now what she had not understood then. The caring and the working and the dependability were expressions of who she was. They were not the whole of who she was. The whole of who she was included the notebook she had kept for 4 years and the restaurant she had built and the moment she had chosen without being asked to throw herself toward a man she did not know because she heard a sound and made a decision and moved. She had stopped being invisible not because someone had seen her. She had stopped being invisible because she had chosen to be present. That was the difference. That was the thing that had changed. She turned off the kitchen lights. She walked through the dining room one last time, running her hand along the edge of a table. Her table in her restaurant built with her savings and her work and her own 2 hands and the specific quality of attention she had been developing for 30 years without knowing what she was developing it for. She picked up her jacket and her keys. She turned off the last light. She locked the door from the outside and stood on the sidewalk in the Jersey City night and looked at the sign above the door that said Bennett House, in letters she had chosen herself, in a font that was clean and unpretentious and entirely suited to what the restaurant was and what she intended it to be. 18 months ago, one tiny click had changed everything. A waitress had saved a mafia boss's life. A mafia boss had protected a waitress's life. A detective had watched both of them change in real time, and a security chief had called his sister for the first time in 4 months, and a desperate accountant had taken his daughter and gone somewhere safe, and a criminal empire had collapsed under the weight of the choices that built it. And Rachel Bennett, who had spent her entire adult life being invisible, had opened a restaurant. Not because someone had told her to, not because circumstances had required it, not because anyone had looked at her and decided she was visible, because she had decided, because she had heard a sound and connected it to a truth and moved toward it without hesitation. The same way she had always moved, the same mechanism she had always used, aimed for the first time entirely at something she had chosen for herself. She looked at the sign one more moment. Then she put her keys in her pocket and walked home through the Jersey City night, and the sound of her own footsteps on the pavement was the most ordinary sound in the world, and it was enough, and it was hers. And for the first time in a very long time, that was exactly everything she needed it to be.